Hello, everyone, and welcome back. When we left off our discussion of Frankenstein last week, we ended with Victor fleeing in horror from the creature that he had made, and then seemingly forgetting all about it when he runs into his friend Henry Clerval on the street. But pretty soon afterward, he has a bit of a nervous breakdown. I shouldn't say a bit, he has a full-on nervous breakdown, and Clerval nurses him back to health over a period of several months, which shows how true and dedicated a friend Clerval is. Not only does he do his best to take care of Victor, he has the sense and the sympathy to keep his condition quiet from his family because he doesn't want the news of Victor's sickness to disturb them. So, Victor finally recovers and makes the decision to return home to Geneva. He's been getting letters from his cousin Elizabeth with hints of impatience in them. Remember that she and he have been basically betrothed to each other from an early age. And there's an idea or a hint in her letter that she's wanting him to come home so that they can move forward with marriage plans. But right before he's about to leave college, he gets a letter from his father conveying horrible news. His youngest brother, William, has been murdered. He was out playing late into the evening and someone strangled him in the woods and appears to have stolen a golden locket or miniature that he was wearing around his neck. This is another terrible blow for Victor. Right as he's starting to recover his wits from his last catastrophe, this new one strikes. And once again, Clerval is there to help. How does he help him out through this next disaster? Well, we read this. During our walk, Victor says, Clerval endeavored to raise my spirits. He did not do this by common topics of consolation, but by exhibiting the truest sympathy. Clerval spoke thus as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude. So Clerval doesn't really try to console him, he just tries to sympathize with him and share in his anguish. But that's enough. It's what Victor needs. It's also what Walton is yearning for back at the start of his expedition to the North Pole. To be able to sympathize and relate to one in distress, that's the job of a true friend, according to this novel. So Victor finally goes home under horrible circumstances and feels dissociated from the scenes of his past life before he went away to college. He's wandering around the local tourist spots, putting off going to see his family because he knows that it'll be tragic. And then at one point, in the midst of a thunderstorm, he spies the creature. It's been months since he's seen him, and yet he recognizes him right away due to his monstrous form. And no sooner does he see him than it hits Victor like a bolt of lightning that the creature is somehow responsible for William's death. Now, even though this turns out to be true, and we'll read how those circumstances came about later, it's strange that Victor's first thought was that the creature was the murderer. There's a part of him that knows he's somehow to blame for everything, though he can't quite say how yet. The creature runs away before he can confront him, with superhuman speed and strength, scaling the side of a mountain on the other side of the lake, and Victor lets it go. William's murder is pinned on the household servant, Justine. The book goes to great lengths to depict Justine's character as being someone who's very benevolent and sympathetic, someone who has been, in fact, like a second mother to William after his own had died a couple years earlier. But the evidence is stacked up against her because the locket has been found on her person while she was asleep, and it's presumed that this locket was stolen by whoever murdered the child. Also, Justine confesses. She gives an account of how her questioners pestered her and called her a monster and threatened her with damnation to the point where she actually started to believe that she was a monster. And this is interesting because later on in the novel we see that something very similar happens to the creature himself. His attempts at being friendly and finding companions are met with rejection. Everyone flees from him as if he's a monster, and eventually he decides that he is one. But I'm getting a bit ahead of things there. Justine is sentenced to death, even though Elizabeth doesn't believe that she committed the murder and pleads with the court on her behalf. And at one point, Elizabeth goes off on a tirade against the injustice and cruelty of the court system and of the law. She says to Justine, "Yet heaven bless thee, my dear Justine, with resignation and a confidence elevated beyond this world. Oh, how I hate its shows and mockeries. When one creature is murdered, another is immediately deprived of life in a slow, torturing manner. Then the executioners, their hands yet reeking with the blood of innocents, believe that they have done a great deed. They call this retribution. Hateful name. When that word is pronounced, I know greater and more horrid punishments are going to be inflicted than the gloomiest tyrant has ever invented to satiate his utmost revenge. Yet this is not consolation for you, my Justine, unless that you may glory in escaping from so miserable a den. Alas, I would I were in peace with my aunt and my lovely William, escaped from a world which is hateful to me, and the visages of men which I abhor." So she also comments a few sentences down that all judges would rather see 10 innocent people suffer than allow one guilty person to escape, which is an inversion of what we would normally consider to be the rule of law and the proper way of conducting trials. In these chapters on the plight of Justine, we can see a bit of Mary Shelley's father's philosophy creeping into her work. Remember that William Godwin was perceived as something of a radical philosopher, and among other things, he was an early advocate for anarchy. In one of his books, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, he argues that while governments may have initially been instituted with good intentions, they're now become more of a hindrance to human happiness than anything. He argues that to function, governments have to abridge the rights of the individual, and therefore they're the embodiment of injustice. The way happiness could come about, he argues, would be for the governments to step out of the way and for individuals to apply their own reason in order to effect change and further the progress of mankind. And here's where he falls in with the ideas of the thinkers of the French Revolution. Reason is still revered as capable of bringing about some sort of utopia on Earth. But we can see through some of the commentary in these chapters on Frankenstein that Mary was at least sympathetic to some of her father's ideas, if she didn't outright share in them, by the critical way in which she has her characters talk about the justice system, and the way in which she depicts this miscarriage of justice. So Justine is sentenced to death, and the whole time Victor is standing by, knowing deep down in his gut that he's the one responsible for all that's happened. He indulges in a good bit of self-loathing here, even going so far as to think that Justine and Elizabeth are better off than he is, because at least they have a clear conscience. They may be grieving, but they don't have some sort of guilt in the back of their mind that's tormenting them. But he doesn't speak up because he knows that he won't be believed. And also, he thinks that even if people would believe him, they wouldn't be able to catch the creature because of his superhuman strength anyway. He does a fair bit of rationalizing here for why it would not be a good idea to speak up, although I think it's fair to point out that someone else might have said something anyway, just to do everything that they could to save their friend from being sentenced to death. Maybe he's afraid that if he tells the truth, he'll be blamed for the murder of his little brother. He's kind of elusive on the subject in his narrative, so we're free to speculate on what his motivations would have been at this time. And after this, moving on into Volume 2 of the novel, the family seeks refuge from their troubles and their woes in a vacation to the Alps. Again, this is the influence of the Romantic poets creeping into Mary Shelley's work. The great scenes of nature are described as a sort of medicine or a healing balm. The soul finds rest from its weary troubles in the wilderness. Victor scales the summit of a mountain and reflects on the sublime ecstasy that the sight instills in him, in a very Romantic poet sort of way. And caught up in the moment and in the height of this ecstasy, he finds himself wishing that he could be a beast, or one of the lower order of animals, instead of a man. We get a fragment from a poem by Percy Shelley called Mutability, which describes this desire that Mary inserts into the narrative at this point. And no wonder why people thought that Percy Shelley had a large hand in writing the novel, if not being the sole author of the novel entirely. The idea behind Victor's thought and the poem is that at least animals don't have to suffer emotional and mental strains. They don't have wandering dark thoughts or guilt of misdeeds. They're free from the shackles of conscience and morality. And this is an idea that we'll pick up on again throughout the year. Victor isn't the only character we'll meet who longs for this sort of freedom. So as he's wandering on about the mountaintop, he spies a figure moving swiftly toward him, swifter than any normal human being could move. It's the creature. There, on the top of an icy mountain, he's caught up to him at last. And now, in this moment of confrontation between the creature and the creator, something unexpected, or at least it's usually unexpected for modern readers, happens. The creature begins to speak, and he's a rational, intelligent being. In fact, he sounds like a 19th century gentleman of sensibility, the very type of person that both Victor and Walton would crave as a companion. It's another mistake that Hollywood movies and cultural references have caused people to make, along with confusing Frankenstein's name for the monsters. When we think of the creature, and the way it's depicted in pop culture, he's always this lumbering, slow-moving Neanderthal who only grunts and groans, almost kind of like a zombie. But here in the novel, he's what one might call fully human. And I think that this is to make Victor's dilemma even greater, because he was just a moment ago reflecting on the differences between human beings who are rational and the animal world, who functions on instinct and appetite alone. He doesn't have an animal or thing to deal with, but a living creature that he has made. And it also highlights the severity of his crime, or we might call it his sin. He didn't make some blob of matter that has some sort of vegetable life. He stole God's role and made something with a soul, or at least that's the impression that we get at this point in the novel. Well, in either case, Victor is furious at the creature. He rails against it and threatens him, says that he would steal back the spark of life from him if he could. But then the creature reproves him. The creature says that he's been the most miserable of beings. He's a wretched outcast, and he's looking for answers as to why he was ever born. He says that he understands that people would want to flee from him and cause him harm because of his appearance. But then he adds, "Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me. How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." And then, after he says that a little later, he adds, "O Frankenstein, be not equitable to everyone, and trample upon me alone, to whom thy justice and even thy clemency and affection is most due. Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." In other words, he's saying that Victor owes him a hearing. He doesn't hide the fact that he's violent, that he's done violent deeds in the past, or he doesn't try to deny that he won't kill again if Victor won't give him what he wants. But he blames Victor for this too. He says that he was born a good creature, but misery made him evil, and that misery is Victor's fault, because Victor abandoned him at his creation. Over and over again, he's asking Victor to listen and to be an impartial judge before he condemns the creature to either isolation or gives him what he wants. And then at one point in this scene, he does something that's rather remarkable. Victor says, "I don't want to hear any more from you. Leave my sight." And when he says, "leave my sight," the creature takes his giant, monstrous hand and places it over Victor's eyes. And he says, "Okay, you can't see me anymore, but you can still listen. You need to hear what I have to say." And this is interesting because the monster knows at this point that his physical appearance condemns him. People take one look at him and they won't even give him a chance. But he also knows that his voice, his language, is civilized. He knows that it's closer to human than the rest of him is. And this speaks, I think, to the incredible power of rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of effective or persuasive speaking and writing. It's an art that's been studied for a very long time. The Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle both wrote extensively on rhetoric, on how to formulate an idea or an argument in a persuasive way. Rhetoric is all around us in what we read and whenever we write something for an audience. And learning this art of persuasive speaking and writing is a valuable skill because it can help you to become a good orator, a public speaker, or a good conversationalist, and especially to become a good critical thinker. It's one of the reasons why you're often asked to write essays in classes, and why you'll be writing them for this class too. Because when you write an essay, you can see your argument and your main points laid out in front of you from a sort of bird's eye perspective, and it's easier to arrange them into a structure or a form that makes the most sense to you and your audience. Whereas sometimes if you're just speaking, you're kind of going from moment to moment and not seeing your argument from that detached bird's eye view. That's why if you ever get into an argument with somebody, sometimes you might go home and think hours later, ooh, I should have said this, or ooh, I should have said that, because your argument wasn't really structured when you were making it in the moment. But when it's laid out in writing, you have that opportunity to go back and tinker with things and rearrange things to make it most effective or most persuasive. So the creature is shown here and throughout the rest of the book to be a very persuasive speaker. He has this gift. He's very good at enticing people to see things his own way. How he came to learn this we'll read about next week. He persuades Victor to at least hear him out before he makes his request, and takes him to a more sheltered area so that he can tell him his story. And at this point, going into chapter 3 of volume 2, our story grows another level deeper. Remember that this novel is structured as a frame narrative. We have Walton's story as the outer tale, and Victor's story being told within that tale. Now we'll have the creature story being told within Victor's story, which is still being told within Walton's story. So now we've reached all 3 layers of the tale. It's not really going to go much deeper than that. And we'll discuss the creature story in next week's lecture. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.